introduce Duygu Özge to all of you. She firstly completed her BA bachelor's at Middle East Technical University in the Department of Foreign Language Education. And then she went on to doing her master's again at Middle East Technical University in cognitive science in the Informatics Institute, and she completed her master's in 2004. In 2010, she went on to completing her PhD in the Department of Foreign Language Education. Again, she's currently an assistant professor at Middle East Technical University in the Department of Foreign Language Education. Now, her interests, also, I'm going to give some information to her interests, is language processing, experimental linguistics, morphosyntactic development, language acquisition, bilingualism, and language disorders. Great interests they are. Personally, I would like to thank Duygu Özge very, very much for being with us tonight, taking her time out, because it's an honor to have you here with us, and it's great pleasure. Seriously, we love it when we have our dear professors here supporting us and taking the time out to share their brilliant knowledge with us. Thank you very much, Duygu Özge.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me and for all these wonderful programs that you've been organizing. I've been following you. Actually, I have also attended a couple of your previous seminars. It's a beautiful spring night, Sunday spring night out. So thank you very much for being here and hosting me. So let me share my screen.
Please do.
Just a second.
Mm-hmm.
So can you see it well?
Yep, everything's good.
Okay, so I will just move things around. Okay, so let's start. It will be a long and complicated data set, but I will try my best to do the justice to the beautiful work that my student Özlem Yeter has conducted with my collaborator, Hura Bagliati from the University of Edinburgh. So let me start by saying that most of the work done on cognitive development, language processing, language development in children have been done with white middle-class populations. So today we will be talking about a different population, which is an underrepresented population. So that's why I really give so much importance to this project, and I wanted to talk about this tonight. So we will be talking about language and cognitive development in Syrian refugee children living in Turkey. So these children are displaced children because of war. And so we will talk about, first of all, we will talk about their cognitive abilities, and then we will talk about their language abilities.
Can I just have one question before?
Sure. You can, by the way, you can ask any questions anytime you want.
Thank you very much. Can we say, because I'm not very sure, but is this the first of its kind, a study on Syrian refugees? Is it the first for Turkey?
It's the first for Turkey, and I would say it's one of the first systematic studies done around the world with, I mean, this much depth, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But I will talk about previous studies, and
Mm-hmm.
when I talk about them, we will also talk about how they differ from the present study.
Thank you.
So let's start by giving some information about what we know about refugees in general. So more than 26% of 26 million people around the world are refugees. Okay, so, and this number is increasing by month. I mean, it changes, it continues to increase every month, even in Turkey and of course across the globe. And about half of the refugee population is, of course, children, and about half of the refugee children have absolutely no access to schooling. Okay, so this is an important fact that we need to pay attention here. And even if they start schooling, they tend to drop out of school, and they are 5 times more likely to drop out of school compared to non-refugee, monolingual, or other children populations. Okay, so we have seen 6.7 million people flooding Syria after the war in 2011, and Turkey, hosts 3.7 million of the Syrian population, and 1.7 million of this population is children. So when we look at this graph, this is taken from Milli Eğitim Hayat Boyu Öğrenme Genel Müdürlüğü. So I don't know how to translate this right now. But this shows the number of Syrian children in Turkish schools across the years. So we see that the number is increasing, which is a positive development. But when you take a look at the population, the population across the years, it is also increasing, and we see that almost half of the children do not have an access to education. Okay, so this is important in this graph. And when we look at the percentage of Syrian children in Turkish school across the grades, we see that 75 to 80% of children attend primary school and secondary school, which is not too bad, I would say. This is reasonable given the situation. However, when we look at this graph, something that is very stark attracts our attention, which is the fact that 80% of this population, attending the secondary school, drop out of school. Half of the 80%, I would say. So around 40% we have attending the high school. So almost half of the children attending primary school leave school after secondary school. Okay, and when we look at the preschool education, another important figure is attracting our attention, which is that 34% of children, only 34% of them have an access to preschool education. Okay, so this is interesting, and this is very sad, I would say, because these children do not have the right to have the most important step for their education in life. Because most of our neurological, cognitive, emotional, social development takes place during the first 5 years of our life. And preschools are extremely important in facilitating healthy growth. So we see that only the minority has the right to have preschool education. So, okay. And again, when we see the reasons, again, I take the reasons from Milli Eğitim Hayat Boyu Öğrenme. We can increase, of course, we can talk about other reasons, and I can think of other reasons, of course, but 2 important factors are living below breadline and language barrier. Okay, so we will try to understand how socioeconomic status and language barrier might have influence on the development of these children. So when you look at these children in the society, impressionistically speaking, they seem to be well adjusted to the community. I mean, they can speak Turkish, they can communicate in Turkish, they act as the translators of their mothers, other family members, but we don't have any information about their linguistic development. And how else being a refugee might influence our development in general? I mean, we know that refugees experience all sorts of, negative experiences: war, torture, physical assault, malnutrition. I mean, I'm not going to count any of them. I don't want to depress anyone, but we see that all of these negative experiences have certain influences on children's mental health, on their academic life, on their economic and social well-being. Okay, and these negative influences have been well documented so far. Again, we don't have any information, almost no information about their cognitive development and how all of these factors might influence their cognitive development. Okay. So when we look at how trauma could influence one's cognitive abilities, we see that the most important changes in your neurological, cognitive, and social and linguistic skills take place between age 4 to 10, okay? And your cognitive abilities by age 12 predicts your later life outcomes. What do I mean by that? So if you have limited higher order thinking skills, limited executive function skills, these would predict your later life experiences, such as your literacy skills, for instance, your language skills, your social abilities, your success, academic success, your chances of attending higher schools, your chances of finishing them, or the possibility of finding a good job, or, possibility of committing crime or having problematic relationships, divorce rate. I mean, these are all correlated with executive function abilities at early ages. And we know that trauma negatively influences your cognitive abilities. I mean, especially your prefrontal cortex, which hosts your executive function and cognitive control abilities. Okay. So the question that we ask here is that, how trauma of war, displacement, and refugee status would influence cognitive or cognition negatively in these populations. I mean, in children who are refugees. This is an interesting question because on one hand, these children experience trauma. On the other hand, they are bilinguals. So what? I mean, they are bilinguals, but what does it mean? So first of all, we know that learning a second language might influence your cognitive abilities or socio-cognitive abilities positively. Okay, so we have some data suggesting, of course, this is these findings are not settled yet. Still, we have conflicting evidence supporting positive influences of executive function abilities or positive influence of bilingualism on executive function abilities. But there are also studies showing no effect of bilingualism. Okay, I need to catch my breath. Do we have any questions? Okay.
Sorry, I couldn't open my microphone there. I was just going back to what you just said. Does it not affect the bilingualism? Did I understand correctly when you?
No, sorry, I wasn't very clear at that. So I meant bilingualism might influence your sociocognitive abilities positively. Okay. So if there is a positive influence of bilingualism, so one might argue that the traumatic influences might influence you to a lesser degree. Okay. So that's one possibility. But of course, this is just a hypothesis that we are going to test. Okay. So would bilingualism provide a protective shield for these children in their executive function abilities and in their higher order cognitive abilities? So what kind of studies do we have so far? In fact, we have only one study, a recent one, investigating working memory and inhibitory control abilities of Syrian refugee children living in Jordan. So Jordan is a country that speaks Arabic. So this study didn't find any negative influences of trauma. So they found that poverty was a greater predictor of executive functioning than trauma. Okay, and inhibition, they said, was not predicted by trauma or poverty in this study. Okay, and in this study, they only found the effect of poverty and limited amount of schooling on working memory abilities of children. So looking at this study, one could say that poverty is a greater predictor, so trauma may not really influence cognition negatively. Okay. However, in this study, the children were around 11 years old, so that was, arguably a later period than a period, where children moving to a new country. I mean, if a child moves to a new country at a younger period, then we can argue that they may have greater influence of all these traumatic experiences. The other issue is they speak the same language as the majority population. So they both speak Arabic. So we may argue that they had no difficulty adapting the country, or they didn't have so many challenges at school. So the aim of our study is to look at the issue from a more systematic perspective, analyzing cognitive and linguistic abilities of Syrian refugee children at a younger age than tested by the previous study, and to understand how displacement trauma influences cognitive and linguistic development in a country where children have to learn and receive education in a new second language, okay, in a foreign language, which is Turkish. So we tested Syrian children. The mean age children were 9.5, and they were all coming from low SES group. They had 2.7 years of education, schooling so far. And this was our test group, and we compared the Syrian group to two different control groups. One was Antakyan non-refugee bilingual group. The other was monolingual group. Okay, so all three groups were matched on their mother's education. Most of the time, mother's education predicts socioeconomic status as well. But interestingly, of course, expectedly, I would say, Syrian group, when we analyzed how much they earned, what kind of life they lived, we saw that they suffered more from poverty than the other two groups. I mean, our non-refugee bilingual group and monolingual group were also coming from low socioeconomic status, but still Syrian group were living much below the breadline. Okay, so we couldn't really control that poverty so much. And we couldn't, of course, control the years of schooling they had, because they came to the country later in their life, you know, in childhood, and they couldn't start schooling right after they came. And we tried to understand how traumatic, I mean, what kind of traumas they might have experienced. And we came up with a questionnaire for the caregiver. I mean, whoever the caregiver was, most of the time it was somebody other than the mother or the father. We had interaction with grandmothers most of the time and other family members. So we analyzed the trauma index, and of course, the Syrian group had a significantly higher trauma index than the two other control groups. So these children come from low socioeconomic status. They had, they spent, less time in schooling, and they have higher trauma index. So they are really disadvantaged and underrepresented, I would say. So how did we measure their cognitive abilities? We tested working memory, inhibition, inhibitory control, shifting and cognitive flexibility, and fluid intelligence. So we tested all of these 4 executive function skills using different tests. I mean, you can see the tests here. Backward digit span test measures verbal working memory. And there's happy sad task, that's a Stroop-like task, which tests your inhibition ability, whether you can inhibit your initial choices. And Berg's card sorting task measures your cognitive flexibility and shifting, how well you can shift from one decision to another decision, to what extent you can be flexible in your decisions in a complex task. And finally, we tested fluid intelligence using Raven's colored progressive matrices. So in addition, these cognitive measures, so I feel much better now for somehow I lose my breath in the first half of the talk, but now I feel much better. And then for language measures, we tested vocabulary abilities and narrative competence in both languages. So we used Kazakh Beriment and Güven's Tifaldi, both for Turkish, and Özlem has adapted it into Arabic. And we used multilingual assessment instrument for narrative. So this test was available both in Turkish and Arabic. So we used that test in both languages. So I have to say, I have to now underline that it was a very difficult task completing all of these experiments and tests with children. And we worked during the pandemic. We were in different cities, Antep, Antakya, Ankara. So we were traveling, mostly Özlem was traveling, and I accompanied her, as much as I could. And we had a lot of volunteers, a lot of lab members helping us. So it wouldn't have been possible if, the group spent their time, effort, and put their heart into this task. So let's look at the results in, first of all, in cognitive abilities, and then I will talk about language abilities. When we look at their their working memory abilities, we see that Syrian children were significantly poorer than Antakyan group, but we didn't have differences between Syrian children and monolinguals. Okay, so, and we didn't have any differences between Antakyan children, non-refugee bilingual group, and monolinguals. So this indicates that refugee children were at a disadvantage in their working memory abilities. And when we looked at individual predictors, I mean, why would they perform? Why would they have a worse performance compared to non-refugee bilinguals? We saw that their trauma index and the level of schooling, the amount of schooling, the years spent in education predicted their working memory abilities. So the higher trauma you have, the worse working memory abilities you have. The longer you spend in schooling, the better working memory abilities you have. Okay, so schooling improves your working memory. And of course, healthy, non-traumatic life as well. And going back to this, we didn't see an advantage in non-refugee bilinguals over monolinguals. So going back to our initial question, asking whether bilingualism or bilinguals have cognitive advantages overall, we didn't really find such an advantage in Antakyan populations compared to low socioeconomic status monolinguals, perhaps because of the fact that Antakyan bilinguals were not balanced bilinguals, we would say. I mean, we still want to keep that possibility open, other studies. If we had tested balanced bilinguals, we might have found some advantage here. We don't really know. So when we look at inhibition, again, we didn't see any differences on accuracy, on their accuracy rate. But Antakyan group, okay, so you see here their reaction time. So we both test their accuracy and the time it took for them to give that response, give that accurate or inaccurate response. So while they didn't differ with respect to accuracy, we saw that they differ in their reaction times. Antakyan group was slower and Syrian group was also slower than monolingual group. So monolingual group was faster, but they were not more accurate. Okay, so this was interesting. Looking at their shifting ability, so again, we didn't find any differences between Syrian group and Antakyan group on their shifting accuracy, but looking at their perseverative errors, we saw that Syrian children were poorer, so they made more perseverative errors than Antakyan children. So non-refugee bilinguals were better with respect to shifting their initial, shifting from their initial choices, giving up their initial choices and reconsidering an alternative choice. We saw that Syrian children didn't differ from monolingual children, so they performed similarly. This was also interesting because we see that children coming from low socioeconomic status do not show some advantage. Monolingual children do not show any advantage over Syrian children with respect to their cognitive abilities here. So this was also an interesting finding. looking at their fluid intelligence, Syrian children were poorer than Antakyın children, and also monolingual children in their fluid intelligence measures. But our control group, Antakyın children and monolingual children, didn't differ in their fluid intelligence. So again, we checked for predictors. We found that low socioeconomic status, higher trauma index, and limited amount of schooling predicted poorer performance in fluid intelligence. We wanted to see how the amount of trauma could influence those children, and we grouped Syrian children as low trauma and high trauma group. We didn't find any significant findings here because we didn't have so many children tested, I have to say. So the power was so low here, but we had some tendencies. So we saw that Syrian children with low trauma index had better working memory, higher shifting accuracy rate. They made less shifting errors, so they were able to shift from this away from their initial decisions. They had better inhibition abilities, and they were faster in reacting in inhibitory control, and they had less fluid intelligence points. Better fluid intelligence if they have low trauma. Do we have any questions in the cognitive abilities before I move on to language abilities?
Hocam, I would just ask you if it's possible to go back to one slide.
Sure.
I just wanted to say in the last one, I know that it comes surprising to say the ones who have less trauma has less fluid intelligence. But if you look at the points, they are almost the same. I just wanted to make the comparison, but we can say they are almost the same.
Yes. So there's that was surprising.
Yeah, but the past work also shows that fluid intelligence is highly affected by poverty. So poverty might become a stronger predictor here for fluid intelligence.
Yes, definitely. I mean, in previous studies as well, low socioeconomic status is also correlated with lower points or poorer performance in overall cognitive tasks. And here, fluid intelligence was also because of, you say it was also because of their low socioeconomic status.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If we were to compare your results here with the previous studies, were they more or less similar, or were there any differences that you came across?
Yeah, I mean, in a chance study, they didn't find any differences between the refugee group and non-refugee group in their cognitive performance. So, which was interesting. So they argued that the limitations that we observe in their working memory abilities were mostly due to poverty rather than trauma or trauma of displacement. But I think there are some reasons to doubt these findings, because I mean, these children, first of all, are late in their development. They are 11 at the age of 11, which is, developmentally speaking, of course, their executive function abilities are still developing. But the most critical development happens between the ages of 0 to 9, I would say. Okay, so that's why one might argue that these children have finished, or they are already completing their development in those higher order cognitive abilities. So that's one thing. Another thing is these children, of course, they lived the trauma of displacement. They came to a new country, but they go to Jordan, which is also a new, which is also a similar culture, similar language. So moving to a country where you don't know anything about, you don't know the language of, is a critical issue. I mean, we know that children starting preschool in a foreign language have difficulties adjusting to school. Later on, they have difficulties in their literacy abilities. So we see long-term influences of early education in a foreign language. Okay, so these children in the previous study didn't have any of these problems, whereas the group that we tested are experiencing the trauma of war and trauma of being in a country totally different from your own country. So that might be one problem that we see here, and that might be why we observe some differences here with respect to trauma, because we both found differences between non-refugee bilinguals and refugee bilinguals, and of course monolinguals in some cases, and we also found that trauma predicts lower performance in working memory and shifting, okay, and fluid intelligence. So trauma, we can't eliminate the trauma as an unimportant factor. So this is a take-home message, I would say, we would take from.
Just one more thing. I'm so sorry.
Sure.
I am
Go ahead.
all the time, but then can we say that the severity of the trauma is actually effective? I mean, because there are many levels of trauma. Just like you said, the trauma that the Syrian children are going through is totally different to those that have gone to Jordan. Can we say that the level or the intensity of trauma can actually affect it?
Definitely, I would say the level of trauma is an important factor, and although we didn't have significant differences between low trauma and high trauma in our study, there were some tendencies. So we might say that the level of trauma and the type of the trauma. Of course, here in Turkey, they also experience hardship in their economic status. I mean, they live much, much below the breadline. So this is a huge problem, along with the new culture, new language. So these are really important factors influencing your well-being, overall well-being in everything. Okay.
Thank you.
Özlem, would you like to say something?
I also wanted to say both the type of trauma and the age when we are exposed to trauma affects it.
Evet.
So, as you also mentioned before, the children in our case were exposed to trauma when they were just developing their cognitive abilities.
Exactly.
They were not developed, they were not mature in their cognitive abilities. But the children in Jordan who were refugees, they were around 11, 14 years old when they came to Jordan. And they almost were near mature in their cognitive abilities, so they didn't get affected by those trauma. Both the type of trauma and age of exposure to trauma would affect, I would say.
Yes, that's very important. Thank you, Özlem, for reminding. So the earlier you are exposed to, earlier in your neurological development, you are exposed to trauma, the worse effects you see, and the longer you experience all these effects. I mean, that's why the first few years are extremely important in all aspects of development. Yeah, that's an important thing. Thank you, Özlem. So let's have a look at the language abilities. So starting with the vocabulary abilities, I know this slide is complicated, but you know, the take-home message is that, I mean, this is Turkish. So Syrian children performed lower than Antakyan group and monolingual group, both in their receptive vocabulary abilities and expressive vocabulary abilities. I mean, receptive vocabulary abilities are tested by just saying the word and showing the picture to the child, and the child is just selecting it. So it's just testing the comprehension skills. Expressive vocabulary task is asking the child describe the picture they see. So it's testing their production abilities. So they are lower than Antakyan group in both receptive and expressive abilities, which is normal. I mean, this is a new language. This is their non-dominant language. And when we test, when we try to understand the predictors here, we saw that schooling was a predictor. So the years spent in education, of course, they will increase their vocabulary size with systematic exposure to language. And looking at their vocabulary abilities in Arabic, so children, Syrian children were better in Arabic than Antakyan group. So Antakyan group had lower vocabulary abilities despite the fact that they are exposed to the language from birth. So another difference between these two populations is that Antakyan children are exposed to both languages from birth, whereas Syrian children are exposed to Turkish later. So they are, of course, we consider both of them balanced bilingual, you know, early bilinguals, but still Syrian children, we would have expected Syrian children to have greater Arabic vocabulary skills than we observed here. So that was a surprising factor here. Again, when we tested the predictors, we saw that schooling was correlated with poorer Arabic vocabulary. So the more schooling you have in Turkish, the poorer your Arabic gets, which is not surprising again. So going back to the narrative results. So this narrative test included 4 different stories, and 2 stories, two stories were relatively easier, and the second pair was relatively more difficult, more complex. So we tested 2 stories in in Arabic, and 2 stories in Turkish. So bilingual children were tested on 4 stories in total, whereas monolingual children were tested on 2 stories. We audio recorded and transcribed these stories, and then we analyzed them in CLAM. So the results, looking at the story structure, first of all, in Turkish, we saw that Syrian group narrated less coherent stories in Turkish. Okay, and Syrian children were also less coherent compared to monolingual children, only in the second, I mean, more complex stories. So when it comes to simpler stories, they were fine when compared to monolinguals, but when we compared the 2 complex stories, they had some problems in coherence. And again, Antakyan children, so bilingual children, non-refugee bilinguals, were more coherent in the complex stories they told compared to the monolinguals. So we see some advantage of bilingualism here when we compare Antakyan children to monolingual children. Again, these children are matched in socioeconomic status. Looking at the story structure in Arabic, as we expected, Syrian children were better than Antakyan children in their Arabic. So they were better in their dominant language, in their first native language, I would say. And now let's compare the microstructure. In microstructure, we focused on syntactic complexity and the number of, the variety of the vocabulary they used, okay? So looking at the graphs, we see that Syrian group didn't have much variety in their Turkish narratives compared to Antakyan group. They produced shorter sentences and less structures with less syntactic complexity. Okay, so do I miss anything here? Let me check. So when we compared Syrian to monolinguals, we had exactly the same pattern. And when we compared Antakyan to monolinguals, non-refugee bilinguals to monolinguals, interestingly, despite the fact that they had more coherent stories, here Antakyan children used less unique words. So they had less variety in their vocabulary in the first stories, in the easier stories somehow. But they didn't differ with respect to their syntactic complexity. So this is in a way in line with our findings in the vocabulary task, very parallel findings in all of these comparisons with respect to vocabulary. Looking at the microstructure in Arabic, again, as expected, Syrian children outperformed Antakyan children in the variety of the words and complexity of their sentences. And when we compare the language abilities of Antakyan children and Syrian children for their dominant languages, so this is somehow complex, bear with me. I had difficulty processing this myself, so Özlem, help me if I have any problems. So the dominant language for Antakyan children is Turkish, okay? The dominant language for Syrian children is Arabic, okay? So they differ now. Interestingly, when we compare their vocabulary sizes in their dominant language, Syrian children had smaller vocabulary, okay, even in their native language, even in their Arabic, when we compare the Turkish vocabulary abilities of Arabic children, okay? So we see that their language abilities, their vocabulary abilities are decreasing, okay, here in Turkey. And with respect to coherence of the narratives, we didn't find any differences, so coherence is fine. With respect to the variety of vocabulary, they were similar. I mean, when I say they were fine, I don't mean to say they were fine. None of the groups we tested were fine in any of these measures. We didn't have a group with high socioeconomic status here, okay? But on the basis of previous studies, I can clearly say that all of these groups performed lower than typical white middle class children, okay? So we see in every measure, we see the effect of low socioeconomic status compared to previous studies. When we also compare Syrian group to Antakyan group with respect to their syntactic complexity in their complex sentence in their dominant language, we see that, again, we see that Syrian group was at a disadvantage. Okay, so we can, from this slide, we can conclude that Arabic abilities of Syrian children are diminishing with respect to their vocabulary size and syntactic complexity. Vocabulary size is most of the time correlated with syntactic complexity in development. I mean, if you test the child in their vocabulary size, you can predict how they will perform in syntactic complexity measures. So they are correlated in general, and we see a similar pattern here. And vocabulary size is also correlated with other cognitive abilities. Okay, so if you test the child on their vocabulary, smaller vocabulary size would predict limited performance in executive function abilities. So this is also in line with the overall picture that we have here. Okay, so however, when we look at the language abilities in the dominant language, we can say that Antakyan children had larger vocabulary size than that of Syrian children, as I said. They didn't have any differences with respect to their coherence. And again, Antakyan children produced more complex sentences. Okay, summary. When we look at the summary, we see, let's first of all look at the comparison between Syrian and Antakyan children. I mean, refugee and non-refugee group. We saw poorer executive function abilities in working memory shifting and fluid intelligence on 3 measures. We didn't find any differences with respect to inhibition. So this is interesting because inhibition is one of the abilities where bilingual children show advantage in. Okay, in previous study we see, I mean, of course, again, this is none of these findings are settled, but most of the previous studies show that bilinguals may have advantage in their inhibition. So here, the fact that we didn't find problems in Syrian group in their inhibition might be due to the fact that they were bilingual. So here, only in their inhibition abilities, their bilingualism seems to be helping them. So this could be one, hypothesis. I can't say that this is a, solid correlation, but this is just, a speculation at this point. So they had good vocabulary, they had better vocabulary and narrative abilities in their dominant language. And Syrian group's vocabulary abilities in their dominant language was poorer than that of Antakyan group, as we discussed. In narrative macrostructures, they were similar with respect to their dominant language. Antakyan children were better in all narrative microstructures measures in Turkish. And in Arabic microstructure, Syrian children produced more unique words and syntactically more complex sentences in the first studies compared to Antakyan children. So Syrian children were better than Antakyan children in Arabic narrative microstructure. Comparing Syrians versus monolinguals, we saw that refugee children had slower reaction times in inhibition and poorer fluid intelligence compared to monolingual children with a low socioeconomic status. Of course, their Turkish vocabulary abilities were poorer compared to monolinguals. And of course, in Turkish narratives, again, the monolinguals outperformed refugee group. Okay, looking at the Antakyan and Antakyan bilinguals versus monolinguals. Interestingly, Antakyan children were slower in their inhibition test, but they didn't have differences with respect to their accuracy. They had similar language abilities, so we didn't see the advantage for bilinguals here for language abilities. But interestingly, when we check their narratives, the coherence of their narratives, bilinguals were more coherent than monolinguals here. So there was an advantage of bilingualism, I would say, in telling more coherent stories. Maybe, I mean, Özlem may talk about this more, but maybe it may be due to the fact that Arabic is an oral culture. I mean, they are exposed to oral stories more often, I would say, than monolingual Turkish children. Anything you want to add, Özlem?
I would want to touch on two things. The first thing you said, yes, it is shown in the literature that a child's ability to tell a coherent story is also dependent on their culture. So this could be a cultural effect. And another thing would be telling a coherent story is also dependent on child's theory of mind ability, because you have to know that your listener does not have the same information you have. You have to tell it in such a way that someone who doesn't know the story should be able to understand you. So this could be a combined effect of both culture and theory of mind abilities, but we cannot discuss it really clearly because we didn't test their theory of mind abilities. This is just a speculation.
Yes, but again, bilinguals have been shown to have better theory of mind abilities in several studies, in several previous studies. But of course, I mean, we didn't test theory of mind with a specific task here. So with respect to the variety of the words they used, monolinguals were better than bilinguals. So here, bilinguals didn't show an advantage with respect to the size or variety of their vocabulary, but they didn't show any differences with respect to syntactic complexity. So I can maybe have questions at this point for, one or two questions, clarification questions, if you have, before I move on to the discussion.
Okay, does anybody have questions? Because it's constantly me talking. So I've always got something to ask, so I'm not going to. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. If not, there's just one thing that's I'm wondering. Now, you said the Syrians' vocabulary in Arabic was very low, and you said it may be related to their schooling in Turkish. Then could we say that, am I right in understanding that because they're learning Turkish, they're starting to lose their Arabic vocabulary? Is it related to that? Or maybe could it be that, I don't know, I'm not very sure, but because of their trauma, because of their lifestyles, could this be an effect more than the schooling?
No, I don't think it's because of trauma. This is a typical pattern that we observe in all bilinguals. If you move to a new country, first 2 years, you are dominant in your first language, native language, mother tongue. And then all of a sudden, within 2 years, 2 years of schooling it looks really, really short in a human life, but suddenly they become more dominant in the majority language. This is because of systematic exposure to the dominant language, to the majority language. They hear it at school, at every level, at academic level, at social level. They hear it outside of school when they communicate you know, in the society, when they work, when they interact in the market, when they play with their peers. So this is another factor. And also, these children speak Arabic only at home with their families. So there's a specific division between where they speak the language. Okay, so this division is also important in your focus on the language and in your identity formation as well. So you want to form your identity from the perspective of the dominant culture and dominant language, especially at early years of life. You want to be the same as everyone. You don't want to be different. So this is another factor. So all of these factors combined, I think we have such a pattern. But of course, I mean, this is an important fact, or this is an important finding that we need to think about, not only for Syrian children, but also for Antakyan children. So Antakyan children are also getting, I mean, their vocabulary and narrative abilities are also diminishing across the years. Okay, so the same pattern applies to non-refugee children as well. So that's why I don't think this is related to trauma.
Thank you.
So let's continue this summary. Trauma and limited access to schooling predicted poorer working memory abilities. Trauma, limited access to schooling, and low SES, socioeconomic status, predicted poorer fluid intelligence. Higher years of schooling in Turkish was correlated with poorer Arabic vocabulary abilities for both groups, as I said, and overall poorer cognitive and language abilities in refugee bilinguals than in non-refugee bilinguals. So, conclusion, this has been the first systematic evidence showing that refugee status and displacement trauma might influence our cognitive functions negatively. Pure performance and fluid intelligence, working memory, and shifting abilities. We can attach all these performances to being a refugee, because we try to match our groups with respect to mother education, socioeconomic status. But of course, as I said, socioeconomic, with respect to socioeconomic status, we don't have full matching here. So this is fully in line with studies showing that early exposure to trauma might influence your cognitive functions negatively. And Syrian children perform similarly to monolingual children in working memory, shifting, and inhibition, especially in accuracy. So this may be some effects of bilingualism. Here we say, or we think, here bilingualism may have acted as a protective shield for these children, because I mean, yes, Syrian children performed poorer than non-refugee bilinguals, but they didn't perform poorer than monolingual children in these skills. Okay, so it seems as if something, possibly their bilingualism, is protecting their cognitive abilities here when we compare them to low SES monolingual children. Okay. However, we didn't observe an advantage in non-refugee bilinguals when we compared it to monolinguals. So again, as I said, this may be because of the fact that they were not balanced bilinguals. They were not exposed to Arabic and Turkish equally. They had more and longer exposure, more systematic exposure in Turkish than in Arabic. So these may be possible reasons. Yeah, bilingual groups performed better in their stronger languages. And we can say that Syrian children do not show gross differences in their Turkish abilities. Yes, they performed poorly than, their non-refugee peers, but overall, when we compare, okay, so this is complicated. I need to be correct. When we compare Turkish of Syrian children to the Arabic of Antakyan children, we see that Syrian children's Turkish was better than Arabic of Antakyan children. Okay, so trauma, schooling, and low SES have great influence on cognitive development, both in bilinguals and monolinguals. What do we say as a conclusion? So we don't want all of these findings. I mean, we don't want anybody to take these findings and to conclude that Syrian children or refugee children have lower cognitive and linguistic abilities. Okay, this is not what we are saying. What we are saying is that these children are at a disadvantage because they receive monolingual education. So because they don't have enough and equal rights in schooling and socioeconomic status. So we suggest that especially at early stages of education, children should receive bilingual education, refugees and non-refugees. We should ensure that children have equal rights in schooling, and we should try to increase their socioeconomic status, especially the socioeconomic status of refugee children, because they live much, much below the breadline, as I said. So we could provide systematic interventions to address their trauma. We should produce support in their mother tongue. And of course, if we could train teachers in state schools, I mean, to be vigilant about their symptoms of anxiety or PTSD or their difficulties they're having with respect to the language, this would be a great support for refugee children. So many thanks to Özlem and Hugh. Many thanks to Asam, SGD'de Asam, who helped us, who found almost all of our refugee children. Many thanks to Many Language and Cognitive Development Lab, all the members, volunteers, and many thanks to our students who helped with data collection and coding, and many thanks to funding agencies who supported us. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That was seriously a splendid presentation. I enjoyed it very much, and I'm sure everybody else did. It was great. The topic's very interesting, and we got to think about things that we had never have thought. Talking about myself, it's very interesting outcomes. Does anybody have any questions, either on Zoom or those following us from YouTube? Feel free to ask your questions. Write it down on chat. We will get them through to here, and we will ask. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. One question that I usually ask, because most of the people watching our programs are students, and these sorts of presentations and everything they learn from here can actually show them a path to where to go, what to research. If a student, say, wanted to carry out similar research on bilingualism, or especially on these refugees, how would you advise them to go? What would you advise them to do first? How should they set out to do such research?
Mm-hmm. I mean, first of all, you need to have well-defined research questions, right?
It all goes down to the questions. The questions are the most important.
Yes. You need to have solid theoretical reason to conduct that study. You don't just take two groups and compare them. So that's the first thing. And then, of course, trying to find the groups and ensure that they are matched on multiple levels. That's the most difficult. That was the most difficult part of this project, because we tried really, really hard. I mean, we tested many more children than we report here. You know, Özlem spent her 2 years with many other lab members, many other volunteers, to test and to code their data, to analyze the data. But these children were not matched in multiple grounds. I mean, we needed to make sure, we needed to select groups that were matched at least on, their mother, the mother's education, their, one difficulty was about socioeconomic status, as I said. Normally, mother education predicts socioeconomic status. It does to some extent. I mean, when you look at these Syrian children, it did predict their socioeconomic status when they were in Syria, not when they are in Turkey. So that was the problem. So these children had a much better life in their countries compared to their life here. I mean, they had low socioeconomic status in Syria too, but here they almost starved. They didn't, I mean, Özlem can talk about it. I mean, they didn't have stoves. Özlem was telling me about all kinds of hardships all these children have. I mean, they didn't have stoves, they didn't have food. Özlem, you can talk about it a little bit. I think this is important.
To carry out such a test, such a design with these kind of groups is really difficult. You will have a lot of problems that you haven't thought about. For example, we had to meet the children at least 2 times because there were many tests and we didn't want to tire them too much. So we were okay, we made our schedule and we did our first test and we are expecting them for the second time, but they don't come. So as we find out, they don't have the money to take a bus ticket and to come to there. So we had to come up with another solution to give them the bus ticket first and then to come. And then we thought, okay, we are taking their time and they have they don't have so many people in the house, but one mom or one grandma is taking care of 9 children, 8 children. So if they come with the child, they have to leave the whole kids there and you cannot take them again. I mean, there are so many problems. Or sometimes the child does not get attention from anyone. And when we want to test them, they are really happy that we are talking to them, that somebody is asking something to them. So they want to talk about their whole lives. But then we have the time issue. And we want to talk to them, but it's really saddening. And parents talk about how difficult it is for them to find a job because they don't speak the language. One of the fathers was a lawyer back in Syria, but when he came here, just because he doesn't speak the language, he lost and he said that he's collecting stuff from the trash bin. And it is really difficult to be able to ask them all these questions and to conduct the study, knowing that they came from these kind of difficulties. And they were, what I really liked the most and really affected me much was when we wanted to offer them like for participating and taking their time, we gave them some market cards so that they can buy simple things at least. They were so ashamed. They didn't want to take it first. They said, we just came here to see our children's Turkish skills, like how well they are doing. Because in school, they don't get enough attention. They don't speak the language much. They don't understand much from the classes, from the lessons. So parents are really, really concerned about their children's abilities, how well they are adjusting to the culture, how well they are learning the language. But they just need a little more support. And they would do perfect. And with that supporting environment in their houses, they just need a little bit of support.
Yeah. Yeah, so that was, I mean, the difficulty. So you need to protect yourself as a researcher too from depression when you're working with these underrepresented, disadvantaged populations, because you, I mean, at one point you feel that you can't take more. Yes. For instance, Özlem was testing those children in their houses initially, but then we had to give up because it was so overwhelming to see all these conditions. I mean, these people experience, they live in those conditions, but you can't really see them living in those conditions. These were the most important lessons I think we derive out of this study. And we are wondering whether these children would show any disadvantage in any of these cognitive abilities if we tested them in Germany, in a country where they had equal rights with respect to education, equal support in both of their language, because they are bilinguals. We don't want children to lose one of their languages. It's very sad. It's very sad to see that refugees and non-refugees lose their mother tongue. Of course, it's wonderful to have wonderful Turkish skills, but we want to keep bilingualism, because bilingualism is important at many levels, at societal level, at cultural level, at linguistic level, at cognitive level. So that's another lesson we derived from this study. And it's easier. I mean, when we chat with teachers, when we chat with other people working in charity organizations, we see that they feel at a loss to help with the refugee children in their classes or refugee children in the community centers. So we need to have more systematic help in not only in their mental health, not only in, I mean, we always think of primary needs. Primary needs are, of course, security, you know, living away from danger. These are important, but other factors, other domains are also important. If you lose your cognitive abilities, it's not a problem only for the individual. It's a problem for the society, because all these skills that we test show how the person will perform in the society in the long run. And whether they will stay in their jobs, whether they will stay in their marriages, whether they will stay at school, whether they will, you know, nourish themselves socially and, I don't know, in many other ways. So these are all crucial abilities that we need to take care of at an early age. So we need to pay specific attention. We need to think really hard to secure linguistic and cognitive, healthy linguistic and cognitive development for everybody in this country and around the world. So I think that's the message that we want to underline here. And what else we can suggest? I mean, well, we can suggest, you know, that they can, I mean, people or students who are conducting research with disadvantaged populations may limit their questions. So do not have very large, very global questions and measures here. It was very difficult to analyze all of these findings. You know, we had data from Turkish, data from Arabic in both narrative and vocabulary abilities, data from many cognitive abilities. So that was another problem that we had. It was a difficult task to understand what is going on in the data. Okay, So we have questions, I think.
Yes, we have great questions. Turan Alp raised his hand first, so let's start with Turan Alp and then we can go on to Adem next. Yes, Turan. Yes, we are listening.
Maybe you can write it in the chat.
Yes. Alp.
Adem.
Turan Alp. Okay, let's continue with Adem then until.
Hi, Hocam. Thank you for your presentation. What I am going to ask will be a bit irrelevant because you have not tasted it. But I wonder the metaphor processing abilities of Syrian children because they had a trauma and also they are disadvantaged in schooling. So I wonder the effects of these in metaphor processing actually.
Thank you, Adem. Very good question. Thank you. Well, I don't know, but I can predict that they may have difficulty understanding Turkish metaphors, of course, but I'm not sure how they would perform in their Arabic metaphors. I mean, when we were testing these children, their responses to comprehension questions in the narrative tests, which included some theory of mind abilities. I mean, we didn't test theory of mind directly, but we had some questions, asking them to involve their theory of mind abilities, such as what would you do in this situation? How do you think the dog felt when somebody else, took the bone away? Such questions that would require your theory of mind abilities. We saw that they were quite good actually in their theory of mind abilities. We didn't see a significant difficulty. So, knowing that metaphor understanding is related and correlated to theory of mind abilities, I wouldn't expect, so many differences. But of course, looking at their vocabulary abilities in general, that makes me think, think that metaphor abilities might have some negative influences. So I don't really know, but I have some reasons to expect good performance and poorer performance. So one has to test it. I think this is a good empirical question, Adem.
Okay, thank you.
We have a metaphor processing study going on in our lab. We were not planning to test Syrian children, but if there are students who are interested in it, why not? I mean, but it's very difficult.
Could have very interesting results, I think, maybe.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, why stop? Why not continue with the Syrians? I think.
No, we don't stop. We have other questions. Now we have to prioritize the questions. So we are not stopping here. We have more plans to come, but yeah.
Great to hear.
Not about metaphors for the time being.
Yes, Turan, are you there? Turan, we can't hear you. Okay, I think he has a problem with his microphone.
Yeah.
If you like, you can write in chat. We could read it out for you. Does anybody else have a question while we're waiting for Turan to fix his microphone, if he can?
It was a very long and complicated presentation.
Yes, it's 9:30. I didn't realize. So sorry for keeping you so long. It was such a nice presentation, seriously. It's very fulfilling for me as a viewer, and I'm sure everybody agrees with me. Well then, if nobody has any more questions, and Turan, if you're not writing, I think we're going to slowly end it because we've taken up too much of your time. Okay, I think we're going to slowly end it. Thank you so much. Seriously, it was a lovely presentation and great work. I can see that there's been a lot of effort by yourself and Özlem and a very great team. Things like this, research such as this, need an efficient and great, powerful team. So I can see that you have the perfect team, and I'd like to congratulate all of you because you have seriously carried out a brilliant research. And I'm hoping to hear much more of your successful research and your conclusions, hopefully. Seriously, thank you for being with us tonight. If you have anything to say.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for bearing with so much of data, you know.
We were happy.
It took me so much to unpack it, and I had difficulty, you know, to convey it initially. I am sorry about that.
It's okay. We're happy.
Good. And yes, I have a wonderful team. I mean, I'm really lucky to have the best team in the world, I would say. They are very hardworking, very intelligent, very good researchers, doing research on every domain of language and cognitive development. So I learn a lot from them. So many thanks to Özlem and all the group who helped us. Ece is also here. Özge is also here. For instance, they also helped with several stages, coding, if not coding, testing, being there, being around, to cry, you know, to cry together. Özlem cried a lot. I did so too. So, but yeah, that was a great team, as you said. I thank them, and I thank you for your invitation. And I really look forward to more seminars that you organize. I'm really happy that students are very active and they are together. I know that you come from Ankara University. We have, you know, students coming from Istanbul, Izmir. So they work together, they collaborate. This is wonderful. We didn't have this environment when we were studying linguistics. So I'm really happy to see that. So good night, everyone. Have a great week because it's already night.
Yes, it's already night. We're going into Monday.
Okay.
But it's a nice end to the week, seriously, on a Sunday, being packed out with all this information. I have to say you did give a lot of data, but it was brilliant to hear for us. Seriously, it was very overwhelming, but brilliant. Thank you very much. Özlem, do you have anything to add before we go?
Yes, I would like to thank Duygu Özge as much as she thanked us. I think without her supervision, it would have been impossible. She was always one phone away, and any tiny kind of problem, she always had a solution. And if I cried, she cried with me. So I'm happy to have her. And thank you for giving us the chance to share what we learned during this project.
Thank you very much. Seriously, I'm very, very happy. Yes, as DilbilimAS, we're here from all over Turkey, all linguistic students and platforms brought together. We're happy, we're hoping to set new horizons for linguistics and linguistics students, and having your support because having professors here sharing their information is actually the biggest support we can have, because without our professors, we are actually nothing. So thank you very much. It's an honor to have you here with us. And to all those attending Zoom and all those attending YouTube watching us, and for all those that are going to watch us, because we're going to have our video on our channel at YouTube, thank you very much. Have a great Sunday, and just like Duygu Özge said, have a great week. Hope to see you guys in our next program. Have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye.